Let's talk to you about the protest in France, where in Bordeaux town hall has been set on fire as French protests continue over plans to raise pension. So we talked about more than 1 million people took to the street across France on Thursday, and then with 119,000 in Paris, according to figures from the Interior Ministry. Let's talk this through by talking about the ongoing protests in France. A global affairs analyst, Calvin Dark, is joining me on the news. Thank you so much for joining us on World Now, Mr. Dark.
Good to be here.
Now, what do you think about the recent violence that occurred in Bordeaux, particularly the setting on fire of the town hall? Do you believe that such actions are justified in the context of the protests?
Well, I believe that the violence and the destruction of the door of the town hall in Bordeaux is unacceptable. Violence and destruction of property should never be a part of protest. But the protests themselves, I think, are extremely valid expressions of democracy. Because we have to remember what the protesters are protesting against has two parts. One is obviously the kind of general disagreement about the reforms raising the retirement age to 64. But the second part is also how this took place, using the 49.3 maneuver where there wasn't a vote in the National Assembly. So I think those two things are what are inspiring these protests. So while the protests are what democracy calls for, the violence and destruction of property is not.
Well, what measures do you think the government should take to address the concerns of the protesters and resolve the pension crisis?
Well, I think that what the protesters are hoping for and the unions are hoping for, because the strikes and the protests are expected to continue, I think they want the measure withdrawn. And it remains to be seen if Macron is going to bend to that pressure. Up to this point, his response has been very tone deaf, and he hasn't spoken out about it. He's let the prime minister take most of the heat from the public in responding to it. Now, there is, of course, the possible striking it down by the Constitutional Council, which that remains to be seen if that'll happen. It's not looking that that's probable, but it's possible. So I think that's what the protesters are looking for. Just don't know if Macron is going to budge.
Some critics have argued that the protests and strikes are causing significant disruptions to the country's economy and daily life. For instance, it has caused disruptions to train travel, oil refineries, and saw teachers and workers at Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport walked out of work. What is your opinion on this? And do you think the protesters should consider alternative forms of protest that are less disruptive?
Well, I think from the perspective of the protesters, they want to be disruptive because that's what makes people pay attention. And in this case, specific people, those around and including Macron. I think just an example of how this has been so disruptive is I just saw that, the planned trip of King Charles III to France for next week has been postponed. And I know this has got to be an embarrassing setback for Macron because he now is having to cancel what was supposed to be part of the first trip of King Charles as king. And now because he's protesting, he can't do it. So I think that this shows just how serious the protesters are. And when it comes to the effect on the economy, I think they realize that. But I also think that they're hoping that would encourage Macron to withdraw the legislation.
So, some of these disruption that they're causing and the destruction of some public places, public facilities, and some other attacks here and there, and them also facing the police, do you think that's the right thing to do? That doesn't speak well of a civilized society, so to speak.
Well, like I said, damage to property, violence, threats of violence have no part in democracy. But I will leave it to the French people to how they conduct their peaceful protest. What I do know is that someone has to give. It'll either be the protesters or President Macron, and it just remains to be seen who is going to give in first. But I think as long as those protests are peaceful, they can be disrupted because sometimes democracy is disruptive. I think that it sends a powerful message to the power structure, particularly Macron.
Right, before I let you go, the pension protests have been ongoing for, say, several months now, and there seems to be no immediate resolution in sight. So what impact do you think this prolonged unrest will have on the political landscape of France, and what are the long-term implications for the country?
Well, I think one of the things that this does in the short term is it really alienates Macron because he's lost the support of several, of the coalition that he had in the legislature. I know that there are several factions, like certain unions and groups, that he has destroyed the trust that they had with him. And I think long term, if you believe Macron that these pension reforms will strengthen the French economy in the long term, but the French citizens are like, we have to bear the brunt of it. Why don't we do other things like potentially raising taxes on the wealthy or other measures? So that remains to be seen if they can work that out. But what's sure is Macron has lost trust among very key constituencies.
Now, very quickly, are there important lessons to be learned by other international communities watching these, say Africa and some other countries that are watching the activities going on in France? Are there some significant lessons to take away from this?
I think what it shows is that even if you can, do something legally, Macron using the 49.3 stipulation in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do if you don't have the support of the people. And I think that that is a major part of democracy, that the people who are elected do have power to enact reforms, to put in place laws, but they have to be responsive to the people that voted them in, or you will see protests, which is a healthy part of democracy.
Well, global affairs analyst Kelvin Dark, thank you so much always. Thank you.
Thank you.